education program. Talking to New America where they talk about you think universities have this tremendous amount of data set on every student.
I honestly didn't mean to.
There is that.
I'm just pointing it out to things that I'm talking about.
I
don't know if you've seen the peers that
I hope we had it by this
Obama was one of the high 6% of Democrats.
Really, you asked talk to this? Thank you. Thanks for the transparency.
Do you want to say anything? Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Tim Castro. I'm Vice President of ITIF. Today's event is called Tech Reporting Too Pessimistic About Tech. We're doing just a few logistics. First, the event is being recorded, and I think we're trying to webcast it. I don't know if it's going too well, but if you're watching the webcast, you're welcome to participate. We're using the hashtag ITIF Tech Press. So welcome to all of you in the room, as well as those who are joining us online. So one question that we've been interested in at ITIF is why certain policy decisions are made. And I think one important influence on policy decisions that really hasn't been explored too much in tech policy circles is the role that media has in this area. The role that media portrays technology affects public opinion, and public opinion in turn affects policy. So this morning I was talking on a panel about AI, and everyone was talking about the role of Hollywood and how Hollywood has a major impact with all the Terminator movies on how we think about AI. But I think when we talk about the press, there's this kind of different expectation in terms of the responsibilities and obligations that the free and press has in terms of reporting on technology and other organizations. So I suspect that most people have an assumption that the media is actually fairly neutral in its coverage of technology. So we wanted to find out if that was the case. Unfortunately, the trial itself is very hard to discern, so we tried to answer a simple question, which was, how does the way technology is being portrayed in the popular press change over the past 30 years? So we're going to do two things today in the event. First, I'm going to provide an overview of our report that we released today that explores this question. And then second, we're going to have a conversation about the broader questions regarding the portrayal of technology in the press and its implications on policy. So we'll start with the report. So before we begin, first I just want to thank and acknowledge Doug Allen. Doug was a policy fellow over the summer with us, and he did, by and large, most of the grunt work on this report. He's a PhD candidate in communications, working with these issues. So the goal of the report was to look at the way that the U.S. print media has covered technology over the past 30 years. And so we did this by examining the claims that a typical reader of a national newspaper would have found during that time. So we were looking at New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. These were three publications where we had good access to a large database. What we did is we reviewed 250 articles. We were including every articles from every third year, starting in 1986. To do the search for the corpus of work we wanted to include, we searched for any article that contained the word technology, and then either worry or concern, which are two kind of negative words, and then progress or potential. We excluded letters to the editor, obituaries, articles sampled about MIT, where just the word technology was being used, if there was not actually writing about technology, or any articles where there were actual claims being made about technology itself. And once we did that, we went through and coded all the articles along three dimensions. The valence of the claim, so whether it was a positive or negative claim being made within an article, the sector in which the impact would be felt, so whether it was a claim about education or military, economy, and then the source who's actually making a statement. Alright, so this first chart just shows the number of articles we review per year. So we were looking at each year, we were trying to get to 25 articles. This doesn't show too much. The orange is kind of the number of articles we skipped. Although it does show, that there were more articles about technology in these earlier years without valence claims, so that we're making positive and negative claims about itself. Alright, so once we get to that, then we have this 250 articles that we spend most of the report analyzing. And what we see is that the total coverage of tech articles actually becomes more negative over time. And looking at the chart, you can see that this is driven primarily by a decline in the number of articles that have an unequivocally positive view of technology. From around 15 articles in 1986, which is about 60% of the total articles, coming to just 4 in 2013, which is 16%. This is showing the issues that are covered in the articles by year. The primary takeaway here is just that the three main areas we're looking at, economy, culture, and security, do make up the bulk of the subjects that we talked about in these articles. Then we're exploring the overall balance of each of these three areas, so economy, culture, and society. And so the first one, when you look at the economy articles, you can see the trend. It starts with large uncontested positive and declines over time to be fairly low in that corner. If we go on to the next one, the security and surveillance articles, again you see the same trend where start off with a large amount of uncontested positive and declining over time. And then you see the articles about culture and society over time. And this one actually, a little surprising, actually becomes a little more positive as you go across. Okay, so this chart is here looking at the distribution of the claim sources over time. Here you can see, there's a few things. I mean, one, unattributed changes over time. Business sector is making a large amount of claims, but there were tremendous findings on this. Right. Then we get to the kind of more interesting questions. This is the valence claims by source. So we started to look to see what claims were being made by the sources here. Here you can see the business sector and unattributed were the largest source of claims. The business sector is making largely positive claims as well as unattributed. Then when you look at civil society and academia, those are the two that are skewing towards the negative. We want to see how this looked if you compared the earlier period, so the first half of the time period to the latter half of the time period. This is actually very interesting because you see that some of the areas like the business sector remain fairly consistent, but when you look at civil society and the government, you see a big change where civil society in the earlier period was actually quite balanced, and then it starts skewing very negative. And the same with government. Government becomes from a largely positive source of claims to largely negative. Okay, so this chart looks at the percentage of positive claims by the source and the target sector. So a few things here. You can see that 35% of all positive claims are related to the economy, and 34% of all positive claims related to culture. From coming from the business sector here. Government is also the most prominent advocate for the use of technology in security and surveillance applications, both in terms of looking at policing, for example, assisting police in solving crimes, or also internationally, so strengthening military capabilities. And then this last chart is showing the breakdown of negative claims about technology that are backed by the source sector. And here you can see that unlike the other ones, actually fairly balanced. Okay, so one of the questions that we're left with is why has there been this increase in negative coverage of technology? And so one explanation for this could be, of course, that the technology itself has changed and the coverage reflects this change that we're seeing. But if you look at past historical debates on technology, you can go back, to printing press, railroads, gas lighting, and electricity, to more modern issues like vaccination or contraception. This doesn't seem to have a lot of strong evidence to support it. Another explanation could be that there's commenting about technology that's changed, and this is something where we think there's more evidence. In particular, we've seen the rise of civil society groups that have kind of as their mission to be critical of technology, to look at areas of technology where they're seeing something negative. In particular, we saw some evidence of this with the average frequency with which civil society organizations are being quoted in the press making critical comments about technology. It rose from 46% in the 1980s and 1990s to about 77% in the later periods. So a third explanation, of course, could be that something about the news organizations has changed. Certainly, we've seen a drop in the employment numbers in newsrooms and a shift in the business model of media companies, especially to an online environment where much of the revenue is driven by clicks. So, this could suggest that these changes can or may attract certain strong claims. So, there's a question of, if you're going to have a headline about a particular policy issue, what's going to attract more clicks? We've seen things like, artificial intelligence continues to help the U.S. economy grow, or something more extreme, artificial intelligence will take your job. Right? So we tend to see more of the latter, although that's something I think the panel can help us dig into. We've also, dug into this phenomenon a bit before in a previous report we put out at ITIF called the privacy panic cycle, where we talked about the way that there's often a panic cycle tied to the introduction of new technologies, and that we see the media playing a role in this phenomenon. The report is available both in the room as well as online. We don't claim to have all the answers in this report, but we do present, I think, quite a lot of new data showing some trends in the coverage of technology. And I think the overall trend is a little bit disheartening. The reason I think this ultimately matters is popular support for science, technology, and innovation has really underpinned the U.S.'s success and the U.S.'s competitiveness. And it suggests that the tech press should be considering whether it's giving undue weight to pessimists or professional critics, and also policymakers should be thinking critically about whether opinions may be skewed when you're seeing public opinion polls, and what they can also do within government to encourage support for technology and innovation. So let me stop there. And I just an issue with everyone's bias, so I'll stop there. But we're turning it now to a panel discussion. We have an excellent set of panelists joining us today. And I apologize, I don't have everyone's bio in front of me right now. I guess they're kind of missing our last page here. I will introduce everyone, but if I miss anything important, please feel free to jump in. So on my left is Amy Schatz. Amy is You're have to give me your title.
I'm Vice President of Media Relations at U.S. Telecom now.
And a former reporter.
Former reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Politico, and Free Code.
Thank you. To her left, Ashley Gold. Ashley is a current reporter with Politico, as well as with Austin Americans.
No, I've worked at Politico and the BBC.
Oh, BBC, that's right. Thank you. Going down our line, we have Deborah Bloom. Deborah is you're going to have to give me your title too.
The director of Women's Science Journalism Program at MIT.
As well as the Pulitzer Prize.
As well as the Pulitzer Prize winning science winner.
And the New York Times best.
All right, and then and I wrote a New York Times bestseller called The Poisoner's Handbook, which became a PBS film.
Then we have Morgan Reed, who's Executive Director of ACT, the App Association, and deep expertise on innovation technology. And last, we have Kat with the Pew, who has a background in journalism, as well as a researcher on many of these topics. So thanks all of you for being here today. To start it off, I just wanted to kind of open it up. All of you had a chance to review the report. And so I wanted to give you a chance to offer any initial thoughts on just what you see as the state of the tech press and any views you have also on the report. So we'll open it up. I'll start with Amy. We'll work our way down, and then we'll kind of begin to do a bigger discussion.
Thanks very much. I mean, I guess I was reading the report, and I guess to answer the question of the panel title is tech reporting too pessimistic about tech? I don't think so. I think reporters are supposed to be skeptical, and that's their job. They're not here to ask you nice questions. They're here to ask you mean questions. They're supposed to be taking a skeptical look at things. So if they weren't doing it as much 10 years ago, then shame on them or shame on me. I was a Wall Street Journal. So maybe, but yeah, I don't think that there's some sort of systemic issue here. I think reporters are doing their jobs, continuing to do their jobs in a really hard economic environment. Reporting has changed, and newsrooms have changed over the years as the economy, as the economics of the news business has changed. And there's many good things that come with that, but generally speaking, I don't see a real big problem.
I'm good. I have to agree with Amy there. And working for a publication that's not one of these three newspapers, the first thing that I would point out is that, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times are not the only publications that focus on tech. There's publications that have tons and tons of tech reporters, and really as everything moves to online, some of those online sites are doing way more coverage than any of those newspapers, and some of it is very, very fun and very pro-technology with countdowns to iPhone releases and live blogs about when Apple releases a new product, and that's all very positive, and people are amazed at the new technology, and they go read a review about it on Business Insider, and they're so excited, and there's that whole side of it, and I think it's going to get more negative as we get more information about how these things work, and tech companies weren't as big 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now they're huge, massive companies that employ a lot of people and affect a lot of people's lives because of their products, so there's bound to be more things to dig up. So it's just kind of a sign of the times as tech proliferates, and I did see, of course, people in media and government, they're going to be more negative because they're in charge of regulating these products. If something goes wrong, they're going to blame the government. They're going to say, why weren't we protected from this? And of course, the businesses, the people touting these products and innovations are going to be positive, and that's just kind of obvious. And I just think it's like anything else. We have more access to information and news than ever, so you're going to get more negative information and news than ever. So that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna basically agree with everything they said. I thought when I was looking at the report, you'll see a phrase in it, uncontested, positive, or negative. That made me want to put my head on the desk. If a journalist is reporting an uncontested one side of the story, that journalist is not doing his or her job. Right, all issues are complicated and have multiple facets, and good journalists know that, and it shouldn't be one-sided or the other. I want to make two other quick points because I am a journalist who spends a lot of time looking at history of science and technology, and the book I cited was set in the 1920s, but the one that I turned in now, which is slightly food technology focused, is set in the 19th to 20th century. And I see this as a fairly normal arc as we get smarter about a subject. And I'll give you one example, actually, out of the papers. How about from the 1920s, and that's the discovery and technological use of the element radium. When radium first came on the market, it was embraced as an uncontested positive. And you can look at the 1920s consumer market and see that they were putting in radium in candy, in cosmetics, in household paint, in candy for children, and it was not until a good 10 years later that you saw both the science and the reporting on the science starting to catch up with those kind of ethical complications and genuine health issues. And I think I could tell you a lot of similar stories by that. I think we're in that process. We're starting to acknowledge that technology has its two-sided sword in some cases. We're starting to look at it in a more ethically complicated way. I think that's to the good, actually. And I think that's smart. And I think that acknowledges concerns across the spectrum of U.S. life, not just the technology business perspective. And finally, and this is a very small point, there's a line in this report that refers to a trend, a kind of catchphrase in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. And speaking with someone, and that's a very literal phrase, it does not mean, let's be scary, it literally means, if it bleeds, it's going to get higher play than if it doesn't. If it's an automobile crash that involves injury or death, you're going to see that in a higher position in the publication than if it were under. And so I just want to put that as a long-time person who actually started as a police reporter, so did this kind of reporting in its context. It's not an alarmist phrase, it's a fairly cynical look at the business of marriage, actually.
Thank you. Okay. So, I'm actually going to agree, but I'm going to say there's one thing that I thought your report dug out, which I think is really interesting, and I separated it into this idea of true, skeptic, and Luddite. And here's what I think is interesting. I think that Ashley, Amy, and Deborah are right. There is a responsibility of technology press to be skeptical. But what was interesting what your report identified is some of civil society and the way that they have moved to becoming closer to Ned Ludd than I would say towards a defender. And so oftentimes what happens is the reporter is rightfully skeptical, wants to know, because we're on the side of cheerleader, right? Our tech will solve every problem. It's radio. And the reporter has a responsibility to say, wait a minute, let's analyze this stuff. The problem is that sometimes happens is when you look for that other side, if the person who's on the other side is a member of civil society where their income stream, their ability to fundraise, their ability to send letters out, is generated in large part by saying, be afraid, Ned Ludd, this can destroy your methodology. Then oftentimes it shades the reporter, and good reporters like Ashley and Amy and Deborah are able to see through that and offer a much more balanced perspective. But I think what you caught is the trend line changing on civil society that saw technology as something that was a net good for those that were less fortunate into something where they were either fundraising reasons, personal reasons, the fact that some of them were just getting old, was a different approach to it. And I think that behooves us in industry to find a way to make sure we're engaging with civil society a little better. Because if I looked at all those lines, you guys are supposed to be skeptical. Keep asking us the hard questions because that helps us drive and make better products. But what's bothersome is when civil society comes in and says, this harms people, and that claim might be more, have less foundational solidity to its claim. And so I think that's the point where I want you to be skeptical, but I want you to be skeptical of me as well as civil society.
I mean, for me, first of all, I'm glad other organizations are doing research for such a topic and using common analysis, which is, one of the methodologies not so widely used. We actually do use common analysis like a business center, but I'm sure as you experience it, very difficult thing to do. Categorize articles and start coding them. So one is thank you. There are two elements that I would like to offer more from our side than what we've seen in the past, 7 years that I've been working with the Pew Research Center. One is the increasing, presence of technology in our lives and actually, using and consuming it. Yes, and that was not the case, not even like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And we've seen that in our data, with social media, online news websites, and how people are turning into these platforms to consume news, learn about the world, learn about politics and government. So in a sense, as it used to be that, technology used to be something that, okay, we studied, it was out there, and we're going to look at how it's performing, how these companies are doing in the business side, but now it's actually integrated in our day-to-day
much, wider and enhanced role than it used to be. So that's, I think, might speak to what you're seeing. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is something that was mentioned earlier about the business of journalism. And that's something that I've been working on for a while now. And the state of journalism today, especially on the business side, is not positive. I mean, there are a lot of not only newsroom losses, but also audience losses, that have an effect, and we've seen that in our data. It has an effect on content that is being produced. I definitely don't have any more data than we do have about technology specifically, but there is an overall trend where all these losses that we've been seeing in the past 10 years have had an effect on how content is produced. The agreements among different organizations of how they're going to share, for example, resources to produce content. So I think these two are interesting points to discuss.
Great. So I want to dig into both of these points, and I want to bring it back here because I think there were more missing points that I'd like this half of the panel to respond to. In particular, I think there are a few things. One, I just want to reemphasize that the report that we did, there was no intent to critique the reporter's skepticism, right? It really, to be very clear, what we tried to do was code the claims that were included in the article. The claims were, genuinely not from the press. It was claims that were included in the articles. So I just wanted to preface it with that. And our goal here, of course, is to encourage actually more skepticism. And in a sense, our recommendation is that, as I think Morgan was alluding to, we think there is a need for more skepticism when it comes to some of the claims that are being included in some of these articles. So let's focus on that first, and then let's come back to the business question, because I think they're both very interesting. So we just open it up again for any responses to anything we said kind of around those points.
I actually wanted to say, I agree with Morgan on that too, that you do find now when you see stories about various tech issues that you do see the same people quoted over, and you see the same organizations quoted over and over. And some of those quotes might be somewhat negative, or some of them might come from that kind of perspective where they're really bringing out the risks of various technologies or tech policies. And I think the reason you're seeing that is it's a pretty easy reason why. It's that, we've got reporters who are under intense deadline pressure every day, and they're trying to find people to provide the other side of the story. And those groups who do that, and they're very efficient at getting back to reporters, and that's often why they get quoted. And that's, I think that's part of what they do, and they do it really, really well. And for reporters, it's so important to try to get as many people in your story as possible in different views. And it's really hard, I think, for reporters these days, as they face these incredible deadline pressures. I started in the business because I'm old, like 2 years ago, as a local news reporter, like a newspaper reporter. I would have like a day or two to work on like just a 600, 700 word feature story. And I can imagine Ashley with she's probably gasping in horror at that. You're expected to write 2 or 3 things a day, and you just don't have the kind of time to wait for people to return your calls. I remember in the Wall Street Journal, I would have like a week to do a feature story, and I would wait 2 or 3 days sometimes for university professors to get back to me, or someone, because you just couldn't connect with them, and they have like a vital piece of information, and it's so good for reporters when they get to talk to different people, because other things come up. That you would come up with different story ideas because you got to talk to someone, like you got to talk to a human on the other side of the phone as opposed to relying on some email quote. And so, I think that is something that, it's too bad that the news business has gotten away from it a little bit, and that's partly because of the economics. But I do agree with Morgan on that you do see a lot of the same groups over and over, and it would be good for reporters if they have time to try to talk to more and more people.
Yeah. Ashley, how do you see that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one problem is just media consolidation and the fact that all the major publications are in DC, New York, LA, DC gets especially, it's a bubble, so you end up talking to the same people over and over, you end up talking to the same lawmakers over and over in Congress, and it's easy to kind of fall back on those habits and rely on your same old sources. I mean, I've been talking with Morgan since I got hundreds on technology, which was a couple of years ago. Maybe I should stop calling him. No, but it's definitely easy to fall back on those habits and quote the same people, and I wouldn't call it getting lazy. Of course, sometimes it's laziness, but it is time constraints and pressure. But when you do get a chance to go out and go to another city and talk to more people, and especially people in academia, that's always really helpful. And I do think employers can definitely be more selective in their sourcing and verify what people are saying and add more voices to the conversation. But like Amy said, it's often a time thing.
There was a quite famous book that came out in the 1960s, I think, called The Visible Scientist. It was by a researcher from New York, Ray Goodell, that looked at some of the phenomena you're describing here, which is that there are always groups or individuals who are very good at being the public face of an issue or of their particular field. And her point was that this was tending to work the way science writers told their stories. And I don't think we've ever entirely grown out of this. It's always been true that reporters on deadline looking for a quick quote are going to go to the person who calls them back or answers their questions quickly, or that you've built a relationship to. There's a lot of us are beat reporters. We work within the same framework of people. We tend to be able to get people to contact us back when there's a relationship of trust between the journalist and the source. So that can really influence the way a story works. I have to tell you, for some reason, this reminded me, I'm a classic science writer. I didn't put in my biography that I'm a former president of the National Association of Science Writers. And there actually is a dichotomy among people who tell stories of science, environment, health, and technology. And my family of science writers tends to mostly, and probably wrongly, think of technology reporters as gadget reporters. Right. It's the new next best thing. But whereas we really are trying to say that everything's complicated, right? In this very, very geeky science writer world that I live in. And I actually, and I think I said this before, it's not just about the journalism. I think Morgan makes an excellent point about the voices that are driving this conversation that we are reporting, and maybe not reporting in as nuanced a context as we ought to. But I want to emphasize again that I think the trend you are seeing is one that shows technology journalism getting more sophisticated to the point that eventually I won't be able to call them gadget reporters. So.
You raise a really good point, and I think the problem that we face, though, is I would love to answer every one of Ashley Gold's questions with, it depends. And yet that makes me a terrible source. I can think of all of the hot button issues. I can offer you a complicated set of realities about it. If this happens, then this. Amy's now working on telecommunications issues. Nothing is as dense as the weird Lego pieces that go together on spectrum policy and broadcasters and da-da-da-da-da. I need to have a conversation with Ashley on deadline. I have my comms team beating over my head to say, you get it tight, you get it specific, and you answer her question. And so the problem that we face there is we are all looking at this role of 140 characters and trying to give an it depends answer honestly in 140 characters, and it fails. So like I said, I love that you guys are skeptical of our stuff, but I think that you said something really interesting, which was you almost paraphrased that idea. You almost said ubiquity breeds contempt. It's not just familiarity, but ubiquity. The constant presence of technology is making all of you say, where do we get more? How do we do it better? I don't like this user interface. Why isn't this still working the way it should be? You were just complaining about your whiteboard on here. Which is hilarious when you consider that you're sitting in a back room trying to connect over a little tiny wireless thing that ties to an LTE signal over a mobile device. The idea of you doing that.
Those are the wired broadband.
Yeah. Oh, and yes, good point. You did that all, and your physicality on the table, which was not literal, her emotional state was really interesting because it was ubiquity breeding contempt. And I actually think that's healthy. But when looking at how a story is written, how do you make sure that the other side is coming to it from that same framework of, yes, we know these are empowering great things, but how do we make the next stage better? And that's the part that I worry, in that idea of cheerleaders, skeptics, and Luddites, that if the story has cheerleader versus skeptic, I'm happy. When the Luddite comes into the mix, it drags that entire orange bar up, and I think that's the part that we would want, all of us should want to push back on. Don't be a Luddite, tell me how to make it better. Tell me how you're solving the problem. Tell me how you're dealing with the person who might be harmed unexpectedly. If you ask me that question, then I want to give you a good answer, because that's in the interest of our industry. Sorry that went long, but...
Everything you want to respond to, look like you really responded and...
And I thought that was such a smart point, and it led me to finish associate to something that will sound almost unconnected, which is when we're talking about sort of the expert voices that appear in stories. One of the things we've been watching in my program and science room in general, and technology is the erosion of what we think of as a trusted expert. And I see this in some of the Pew data too. It's more so, journalists have always been sort of at the bottom of the credibility tower for reasons that elude me entirely, but you see slowly, and if you look for some of the Pew surveys, or if you go to Europe and you look at what the EU is doing with Eurobarometer, this gradual erosion of public trust in scientific experts and technology experts. And so we're also facing in the way we tell these stories, this sort of increasing difficulty in persuading the public that we're talking to someone that they should trust. Right? And persuasion is probably the wrong word for a journalist. But it's an increasingly problematic issue when we try to tell these stories. This expert says this very credible scientist says this, and you're conveying that to an audience who automatically is going to discount some of that in ways that we are just starting to see as a trend that I actually find very worrisome.
Yeah, I think that's, we've been looking at trust, and even recently we looked at, even fake news, which is a whole other level of looking at this issue. But to me, the interesting part is not only, yes, it's been widespread trust, we've been seeing those trend numbers, dropping, same in Europe, the Eurobarometer, you're absolutely right, across, most of the European countries still press in all the kind of formats, there's low trust. The interesting thing is trust really plummets when you're looking at news and information online. And when we asked, whether people that they are online, get news, from social media, and whether they trust this, those that they responded a lot was 4%, and that's much lower than actually local reporters or national news organizations, because we do ask these different elements. So I think that's one thing to think about is when you are transitioning journalism on that online space, that even trust measure even drops further, and that could also explain what we're discussing now.
So it strikes me that, when I think about trust and trust in me, I think of the weather predictions. So if you're watching the local news and you see the weather, pretty right most of the time, you generally believe it, and that's kind of part of the trust. One of the things that I find with, some of the tech reporting that we're looking at, there isn't that kind of follow-up, right? So you see a claim, you actually find out if it's true, and there's not a lot of accountability for claims that have been consistently untrue. Which, when we looked at the privacy cycle, it was one of the things that we found was most interesting. These kind of outrageous, retrospectively outrageous claims, although at the time, I think some of us were saying they're outrageous too. Where you see these claims about, RFID, it's the mark of the beast, and it's, and these will be reprinted in major publications. And no real accountability 5 years, 10 years down the road, where some of these same people are now privacy experts on the latest technology. And so how does that kind of trust, play into the press. I don't know if you see this in other areas, so just open it up, maybe Deborah first.
In terms of, could you clarify the question a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, when you think about the public and its trust in the press and how it's changed over time, are there, after the election, for example, there was this question of, do people trust pollsters anymore? Are there instances where trust changes because of, this question of how correct media incidents are reported?
I mean, it's always helpful if when you're building trust to be right. And certainly one of the things that drives problems for the media is that you live on a very tight deadline. People want to probably make mistakes, right? And we make all of our mistakes publicly. Right. Every mistake we make is a visible mistake, and so if you're in a cycle, and one of the things that is driven by the digital evolution to digital news is the constantness of it. So we're always in a cycle, right? So it's always another thing to be told. Some of that, I think, has worked against us. I will tell you that if you go back and you look at surveys, do I trust the media with the local reporter more than my janitor? We've always been down in the janitor kind of level. And if you go back to early in the history of the media, if you looked at, say, the early 20th century, which was the period where Teddy Roosevelt was calling investigative reporters muckrakers, it wasn't exactly as if people were embracing us as heroes of truth. I think we've always had that issue. It's something that we're talking about now, how do we do this better? And there's some ways that I think we actually are starting to see a transparency corrective to that. One is we're doing a better job, at least in some publications, at fact-checking. So we publish a science magazine called Undark, which is actually a radio-related term, the Night Science Journalism program. And the first thing we did was hire a fact-checker. And it was the very first step when we brought on board. If we're going to look at the intersection of science and society, which is contentious, we better be right. And I'm program chair of the World Conference of Science Journalists, which is meeting in San Francisco in October. And globally, I've got 15 panel members from around the world, from places like from Morocco to Denmark. Everyone's at fact-checking. We need a fact-checking panel, right? So we are recognizing that in a time where we're looking at science and technology in these kind of ethically contentious and often political frameworks, that we've got to do a better job of getting it right. And so I think it's important to recognize that that's a conversation that's going on internally in the media. And that I see us making some positive steps. Does that think do I think we're suddenly going to be the most trusted person at the corner of ours? No. Right. But do I think that people are working really hard to try to improve this? Yes, I really do.
And do you have any more insights on kind of what shapes that trust?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and it's not about trust, but it's more about consumption in general. Like, one of the things that we saw, we put a report, I think a month ago, on, different sources, how supporters of Trump, or President Trump, and Hillary Clinton were consuming news, and what sources they were using. There's a huge divide. And that speaks, to trends like we've seen in political polarization, in, the American society, and I think that's another element that it has been growing in the past, again, 10, 15 years. Increasing polarization in the American society, and it is reflected in media consumption. We saw that in this report where, those that were supporting Donald Trump were concentrating overwhelmingly around Fox News, while supporters of, Hillary Clinton were choosing different sources and concentrating on actually wider mix, which kind of reflects what we saw 2 years ago, again, when we asked about sources, and we saw that more on the ontological spectrum. Again, the ends of that ideological spectrum, meaning consistent liberals and consistently conservatives, are very different on how they consume news and what sources they're using for their news and political information. And I think that would speak, to the levels of trust and parsing through information online, but even offline.
Though, to bring it back to the key part of your question about the technology side, I think one of the elements that I thought Ashley brought up, which was really interesting, is this idea that there is this wide pool of available cheerleading media, which I love, right? The one that's talking about the next greatest app, which is awesome, or the next phone, or the next other product, and so the cheerleader element is something that's out there. The question that I think we have to figure out is, how do we take an audience that gets cheerleading from us on one side and then understand that the other side is going to do the same thing? I was pulling up an article in Wired that talked a little bit about what they saw. This is political, but it gets to the key topic, which was this idea of being able to create a salient exemplar and conflate it with the norm. And the article says this cognitive bias isn't new, but in a media environment driven by clicks, where politicians or anyone else can bypass journalistic filters entirely to deliver it straight to citizens, it's newly exploitable. And so the question I think you're raising about it is, I love the cheerleaders out there. Ultimately, the audience understands those as cheerleaders, but it does mean that the other side is also able to deliver what amounts to incredibly negative, incredibly biased information about the technology, be afraid, chemtrails exist. I could argue that chemtrails is a tech issue, right? There are no such thing, no, they're not spraying things from the skies. But the fact that I even have to say that it's actually got cheerleaders for that concept is frightening. And it works off of this idea of a salient example and what's usually referred to as an availability heuristic. And so those together are creating this environment. So again, I actually don't blame you guys for being skeptics. I think it's making sure that we can provide you with the sources, the information that you need, and then you can break through and get out the skepticism while bypassing the cheerleaders on both sides. Because I think that helps you get to the more blue bars and less orange bars. Or ideally, if I'm a citizen and not an advocate, gray bars. What I was worried about is you had very few gray. You had blue, yay, orange bad, and then blue-gray. And really, shouldn't these articles come out with a little bit of, hey, this does a great thing with technology. Sure, there are some privacy concerns, or sure, maybe this community is underserved, but here's how it might benefit in the long run, and let's see how technology fixes the problems as it moves forward in its next iteration. I can live with that. Sorry, Ashley.
That's okay. I was just going to say that, among my own colleagues, I know that if we know a certain group or a certain person is going to tout the same line they always tout, and they're going to provide that voice, we're not going to go back to that person a million times because it's predictable. We know what they're going to say. I know not every newsroom or reporter would maybe do the same thing, but that's definitely something me and my colleagues try to practice. But the reality is, in a lot of these situations, it's the same players making all the decisions, like on the Hill and in the trade groups. So you end up going back to them all the time because they're in charge. They're in the mix, lobbying and, looking to do what they want to do that's going to serve their interests. So, that becomes kind of an echo chamber. And maybe it's just, that's where all the power is.
Even though it depends on whether you're, not to single out the political, but there are...
we never have a certain audience that, like, the Wall Street Journal doesn't, or the New York Times doesn't, because they have a wide audience, but...
I just think the topic is different, right? Sometimes you're reporting on what people are saying and doing as opposed to reporting about technology itself.
Right, and that's not our purpose, so I can't,
No, I actually want to come back. I want to bring the conversation a little bit to this conversation about the business model. I want to start with appreciate your comment actually you said about the fact that of course our report was looking at a print newspaper. Obviously for a few reasons, one being the record news. It's kind of good. I just kind of wanted to raise the question, and I'll open up to the people that maybe the passion. So, how what kind of trend would you expect if we could go back as far as we could? I guess we could write Wired or something in the 90s. And then, of course, other science and tech journals and stuff, although not with consistency. But what trends might you expect there, or even in the last 10, 15 years in the tech press? And if you think there's another trend, or maybe it's consistent. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on how you think the tech press that's digital might differ than the newspaper press.
I think the tech press that's digital has the opportunity to do more because it's online, so you're not necessarily filling up a tech section of a Sunday paper or a daily newspaper. So you have the opportunity to cover more topics and kind of go more deeply on things. So in that case, it's positive because you can cover more both negative and positive stories about news. But like Deborah was saying, good news isn't really news. That like technology works is not a news story. Like technology crashes and people get hurt is a story. So there's only so many good news stories you can run. That's not what you're seek out when you're reporting. But I do think digital media presents a lot of opportunities, both good and bad, because things are on Facebook and things get watered down and people start to doubt what they see on social media when they go back to online websites. So it's it's more important than ever to be really careful and to make sure what you're putting out is factual for sure. That it's the same like any trend in technology that has great opportunities and pitfalls.
So I guess, just looking at the panel, how much is the business, the business realities shaping that coverage where, you can't maybe cover, SpaceX has a successful launch every time, it's when things explode that's what everyone's writing about. How much is that, how much is the business model that hacking those decisions?
I think, again, that's not unique to the modern digital media that we were going to cover. We were just talking about Challenger exploding in the 1980s, probably got a lot more attention than all the successful shows and solutions that preceded it. I think that's just normal. We used to, the other thing that is our common saying in the news media, besides as if it leads its needs, is we don't cover the airplanes that don't crash. Right, and that's not entirely true. We cover, passenger altercations on the planes. As we know. But it has to be something that makes it a little bit out of the normal. I see both pluses and minuses in the new digital model, and one of them is not going to be a surprise to anyone in this room. Is digital media allows us to cherry pick our sources in a way that print media did not. In the old days, when you would just pick up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Post or the LA Times, you had the serendipity effect. I'm paging through, right, something that interests me, and I'm going to see all these other things that may or may not fit my worldview. One of the big downsides of digital media, and the pluses, depending on where you stand on this point, but to me it's a downside, is that we cherry pick our news sources and we reinforce our own views and we don't see the things out there. And I found myself as a long-time journalist, in widening my sources, which seems to serve me really well. So now I read Politico every day. I follow Jack Schaefer on Twitter because he's funny and smart. And he gives me a hard time if I criticize him on Twitter, and I enjoy that too. But I read Vox, I read 538 because I'm interested in data, right? And I go beyond my normal. The other thing I worry about in this model, and I'm going to tell you one positive and one negative, is the real growth of all of this is coastal. And we've started talking about what we're calling information deserts in the middle of the country. So that we're seeing the big boom of media and the places that are hiring, ProPublic is hiring, the Post is hiring, the Boston Globe is hiring, right? We're seeing some strong media growth on the coast and far less in the middle of the country. And that's an audience and a group of people that really matter. And what we really matter. I came to Boston from the University of Wisconsin where I was a journalism professor. And I have a deep affection and respect for the Midwest, actually. So I don't want to see it fly over country in this kind of information economy that we're in. And I think that works against all of us. We're working on a story, that was my last quick point, I hope, on a technology story, which is looking at is automation going to take away blue-collar jobs? And we're doing it in a very data-driven kind of way, in which we're hearing a lot of kind of hype. Oh, your dog is about to disappear. And we're trying to drill down to, well, what's the reality here? And the reporter I'm working with has been working on that for months now, and has just gotten increasingly less sure of where this actually falls. And so is your uncertainty point. She's coming back and saying, I'm not really sure anyone knows this for all of the stuff we're getting out. But the good thing is, and this is as true with digital reporting today as it was with print 40 years ago, there's a balance between the deadline reporter and the long-form reporter. And there's a difference between the daily reporter and the investigative reporter. And those reporters are still taking a lot of time to do those stories. And if there's something I want to preserve in journalism in addition to the daily, it is investigative long-form journalism, which gives people the time to do it right and get it right. And that is something when we start reinventing, however we're going to reinvent the media, we should fight to preserve that for all of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add, there's a hard reality with newspapers specifically. We saw last year a 10% drop. It was the highest in newsroom workforce for newspapers. And that was the highest actually since the recession. And looking even further, since between 1994 to 2014, we've seen 39% drop in newsroom workforce for newspapers. That's really big, and that has, and many times a lot less. Sometimes they would come to me and be like, yeah, but digital is growing, and a lot of these people are going digital. That's not true. We're looking at the numbers, and we actually did a study a couple of years ago looking at the workforce on digital only, employed at digital only sites, news sites, and it doesn't even, those losses don't compensate, those hires don't compensate for those losses. So I think that's, an effect that has at the newspaper world overall, that it's not negligible. At the same time, talking about these deserts and this, this kind of like maybe even geographical divide, we've seen that too. A third of state house reporters has, is gone. There is, less coverage of the Hill from local newspapers outside of, the big bubbles. We saw that in our, actually 6 months ago, in our Washington Press Corps study. So all these elements, and you see I'm choosing to speak for newspapers because it's not only newsroom losses that we're seeing, but those are reflected in actual advertising and circulation revenue on how these newspapers are operating. And I think that's something really we're thinking about. And how exactly where this space or this industry is going to reinvent and think about the future. Still, an element that I always find very positive, and I'm throwing a little bit negative bad news there, but positive element that we just actually saw in one of our reports was preference of younger people in terms of reading and online. So we did ask people if they are, if they prefer, for example, to listen, read, and watch the news, on what kind of platforms they would do so. Interestingly, those people that they were watching, they said, okay, I still prefer TV, I don't want to do that online. But for reading, we are seeing that migration online. So people's attitudes are, turning to that space, and especially younger people. There is a big generational divide between young people and older people and how they're consuming news, how they're interacting, that kind of social experience. So that's kind of like the flip, the other side of the coin in how news are consumed now and I guess in the future.
And we're building on this, obviously you have kind of a deep expertise, so having seen, throughout your career, working in the Wall Street Journal, Did you see changes in how the business of journalism changed? Did you see that affecting your work? From the outside, did you see that?
I mean, it changed dramatically over the years. As I went from working in local newspapers where you just publish once a day, to then those newspapers started having websites, and then we published 2 times a day. And then all of a sudden, I went to the Journal, and we had a newswire at that point, and we still kind of only, the Journal reporters were worried about writing once a day, and then that changed dramatically over the years from the time I started. The 10 years that I was there, from the time I started to the time I left, I was writing multiple times a day, tweeting, blog posts, all kinds of things. And it was a dramatic change, and a lot of people didn't feel comfortable with that change left, because they wanted to do more long-form journalism, and that wasn't something that just focused on exclusively there anymore. You had to work on daily news and breaking news and those sorts of things. So it has changed dramatically over the years. And I think it's great in a way that we have so much media out there, and the barriers to entry are very low. And so there are a lot of viewpoints out there, and you were looking at 3 newspapers for the city, but as other members of the panel have noted, there are more cheerleaders out there in some respects and more skeptics. I mean, I think we saw this week a really, I think it was dramatic, when we had on Student, the former engineer from Uber, who wrote about her experiences there and her problems with their HR department, and she talked about why she left that company. Back in the day, that would be something that, if she was incredibly disgruntled, she might go talk to a New York Times reporter about that, or a Wall Street Journal reporter. And if they did that, then maybe a couple weeks later, maybe you'd see a story in the paper. She didn't have to do that at all. She just posted it on a blog, and the reaction was instantaneous. I mean, by the next morning, these newspapers across the country and newsites across the country had written about it. The CEO had responded to it, and so you don't necessarily. There's a lot more media out there now, and that's not a bad thing.
That's a great point. I mean, so many, you see this, policymakers, right, using media as a way to go directly to the public, and there's no filter. I want to open it up for audience questions, but I want to first just bring it back to the policy side of this. Which is basically, we talked about some of these changes, we talked about the economics here. How do you think policymakers should be, reacting to this? How should they, filter things, based on changing economic realities, based on, the kind of changing trends that we're seeing, or should, is this as well? Is this something they've always had to deal with, and there's nothing else to here?
Do you mean how should they deal with the news from the study?
How should they deal with the fact that negative claims are going to be pretty more, as you said, and how are they going to deal with the fact that there is a rush to publish more short form, less long form journalism? How should they deal with these kind of changing trends that I'm talking about?
Certainly taking their time with deciding, what's going to be regulated and what's not, particularly on both the House and Senate Commerce committees. They're starting to have conversations about the Internet of Things, and self-driving cars, and artificial intelligence. And it does seem like they're taking their time. That none of them want to appear unfriendly to innovation. They all say they're pro-innovation, and now the Republicans are in charge of everything. They certainly are talking about their light touch regulatory frameworks all the time. So I do think there is kind of a hesitance to regulate technology, or to be very negative about technology at the current moment on the Hill. This should maybe, not a conversation completely anyway. So just another warning to kind of take a look at the whole landscape and see what a technology can really do before you pass a law that would stifle it in any sort of way.
Taking a fairly broad definition of technology, and one of the reasons I ask that is I'm pretty sure there's a reference in this report to GMOs. I was thinking to myself, one of the technologies we've been following is gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9 editing of the genome. And right now there's basically almost no regulatory response to that. And I think people are still figuring it out. And if you look at at least has come so far with U.S. agencies. The USDA has approved 2 CRISPR-edited crops already by announcing that it does not meet the standard of needing to be regulated. this is not an additive, right? We're not adding anything into the genome as you often do with genomes, you're just slightly altering it. And therefore, already moving into the market is CRISPR-edited mushrooms and CRISPR-edited corn. Right, so I think you would call that right, if not non-existent, regulation of the technology. And I think one of the things that we all have to think about, and this is why I was asking about the definitions of technology, which to some extent I tend to think of in a gadget sense, but could be expanded much more broadly, is that I would hope that policymakers were not getting all of their information from people like me. And we're taking a deeper dive into some of these and tracking them as they move forward, because with something like CRISPR, and I say this in a completely unbiased way, even though MIT was just awarded the big patent, with something like CRISPR, it's moving really fast already. There are already catalogs of CRISPR-edited research animals out there. So what I would like to see, frankly, from policymakers is an awareness of fast-moving technologies and if we can really keep up and think in a way that allows us to get ahead of exactly the problem that you've illustrated in this report, which is that we tend to go next best thing with the technology until the ethical, health, environmental, human consequences of us that catches up with us, and then you see a lot of negative response and publicity because it's actually becoming a problem.
Let me just to answer your question, to be clear, in the report we were using technology in a very broad sense, so, especially some of the older articles, it was about biotech, biomedical, certainly, in recent years a lot of articles tended to be more internet related because of the nature of what the coverage was, but the report itself is broadly looking at technology.
I would say that I'm going to do something that never happens, which is a technology person saying something good about a regulatory body. We're closest, but to your point, the Food and Drug Administration actually did what you just said on their mobile medical applications guidance. It came out in 2013, and they actually set it up in a risk framework, and they said there's a bunch of stuff that's not regulated. There's a bunch of stuff that absolutely is regulated. I mean, there's another area which we don't believe has a lot of immediate risk, but we're going to keep an eye out. And we're not going to forego the ability to eventually step in if something hurts someone, but we see that we have months before there was any potential harm. And so there was a government agency that looked at exactly the situation you said and was able to try to come up with a risk framework that allows them to move forward. So it does happen, and that's my one positive note about government regulation that I would say for the year, so I'm running that for the rest of the year.
Any other comments, otherwise I'll open up for questions. Great.
Thank you. So, Rob Evans of ITIF. So I want to build on a comment Morgan said. I think one of the reasons we wrote this report is there was really this question of, it's perhaps not how media is covering it, but who they're covering and what those people are saying. And I think it's not just the public interest groups that have gotten more over on the Luddite scale from Cuban or Luddite, they moved towards the Luddite scale. But it's academics. And I think one of the big things that's changed, at least that I've seen, particularly at my PhD, a long time ago, the academics now are becoming much more like free agents. You advance in academia by becoming a free agent. So if you can do a good TED Talk, if you can be on 60 Minutes, if you can sort of get this sort of really best-selling book outside of academia, outside of peer review, you can really make a mark for yourself. And you see that, for example, Deborah, you talked about jobs and technology. If you read any study on jobs, any article, media coverage on jobs and technology, it guaranteed will start with, in the first paragraph, Osborne and Friends, Oxford study, 47% of all U.S. jobs will be eliminated in the next 10 to 20 years. I bet there's not a single journalist who's ever looked at that study and looked at the appendix. Because if you look at the appendix, you read the methodology. They didn't go down and look at all 702 occupations. They used a methodology based on what's called ONET, and they just ran this algorithm. The algorithm came up with things like, there will be no more fashion models in 20 years because robots will take over that occupation. I don't think Versace is going to be putting his dresses on robots as they walk down the runway in New York. So the point is, I don't need the media to be skeptical of the claims that they're, I want them to be skeptical of the Osborne claims, and at least present a balanced story. And I think I follow this a lot, and I can tell you, almost every story now on tech and jobs is, tech is going to eliminate jobs. And it's going to be massive. And I'm happy to have the media talk about that, but then to also say, wait a minute, here are these other economists who show that that's really not what's going on. So I think it's partly a lot of the louder and sort of more definitive voices, particularly in academia, which, you know, if you're a journalist, you're not going to read the appendix of an 85-page report. It's up to people like us to do that. But I think that's one of the things I think that's making this harder.
Are you identifying a trend, as it were, in academia itself, the entrepreneur, the rise of the academic entrepreneur, in which you need to rise above the background noise of your colleagues and become a star, a public intellectual in some sense?
But if, in the old days, public intellectualism was about, they were really, they were really great public intellectuals. Crystal and Senator from New York. Moynihan, they get great public intellectuals who wrote complex, nuanced, balanced pieces. To be a public intellectual today, you totally want to be, the sky is falling, there's this side. It's much more black and white and much more sort of in your face to be able to be that entrepreneurial academic.
Is that because you end up being an adjunct if you can't?
Something like that. So, I mean, it's a very competitive environment, and some of us grants, high-profile scientists attract money, right? They attract attention. Scientists, technologists, academics. I mean, I do think that's a factor. I don't think that's the only thing that drives it, right? But when we were talking about the report, the Oxford report, I do think that there are pieces of scholarship that take on a life of their own, right? And it's like, it's almost you can't drive a stake through them. They get repeated and repeated and repeated. And that is a problem in the media and academia as well. When you do citation analysis, you'll see that it's like almost trendy. That has to be in your piece, right? Or you won't be taken seriously. That is a real problem. I completely agree.
Well, let me just ask maybe how reporters say, how do you deal with that problem?
But with quoting a study that, no.
Everyone expects you to quote, but it was maybe wrong. Or maybe you haven't looked at yourself, but you're just kind of assuming that other people have quoted it, so you should do it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take a good, hard, long look at it and make sure you're getting a lot of voices on, what the methodology was like and, how much of it should be taken into account as people are making claims. And that's not something we do as much, but certainly when I definitely see plenty of stories that quickly cite a study and really don't get into, how it was conducted, and that's quick and that's sloppy, and that definitely does happen. So, you gotta read publics, you gotta talk to the right people.
Maybe there's something though that falls on us, which is we on the other side have to do a better job of also calling it to your attention. Rob is kind of the past master of, BS. He does that really well, and he articulates it well, and he does read all the studies. So maybe to a certain point, yes, you guys need to do a better job, but it's also maybe something you should ask us. If I cite a study, and I know on our employment study, there's about 250,000 jobs open in programmers. And a lot of you guys, you included, have asked us, where did you do that? Oh, well, we built it up Glassdoor. Well, how did you pull that Glassdoor data? Well, it's these subsets of Glassdoor. I don't think we can get through that whole thing. Now, my comms person is saying stay on message, but I don't mind that question from you. When you ask me, where did you get it? How did you get it? When was it developed? Who else has looked at it? I respect that question from you. So to Rob's point, I think Rob raises a really critical point. You should ask that person signing it, where they get it, how they get it, and who else will validate it. And if you ask me that, I'll do my best to answer it. But if I can't, well, then that's something that I need to take into consideration.
Richard has a book coming out in April on the problems of methodology, reproducibility, called rigor mortis. The scientists are talking about all thrilled about it, right? But it should be kind of interesting.
Quick questions, yes. Right here, we can go right here.
Hi, thanks. My name is Libby Watson. I'm a reporter with Gizmodo. I guess I have one quick comment and one question. Just on this issue of who we're quoting in stories. I think it's difficult, and I think it's difficult for journalists is the lack of transparency. I mean, we all like to quote think tanks and advocacy groups and people like that, but it's very hard for journalists to know who is necessarily paying those people that they're quoting because of disclosure laws for non-profit organisations. You know very little about who donates to think tanks, so that's a problem too. Not one that I'm conceiving, so to speak. But my question would be just about these Luddites that you're talking about. I guess the first question would be, who are the Luddites, and can get some names, and which specific issues do you think the risks are being played up?
Well, privacy is one that was raised by Daniel and by Rob, and privacy edge cases are absolutely a concern, but they are often just edge cases. 2 years ago, NTIA held a multi-stakeholder session on developing short-form privacy notices. In that session, there were groups that were participating, but for the purposes of essentially ensuring that anything that came out scared the bejesus out of anyone who opened it. And they were very open about that. They started from the premise that advertising is bad, therefore we want to make sure that a short form notice shows people all the potential risks that could be had from advertising, and therefore a short form notice must be written in a language that is that strikes fear in the hearts. And if you look at many of those who made those recommendations, and by the way, that's broad. There were a lot of folks at the table who were not that way. But there were loud voices who were on the side of saying, this is something to be concerned about. And then, what you said, when those voices are in the room and they're pushing it, if you look at where their position comes from, some of them have been privacy advocates for a long time who are anti-advertising. They're really unabashed about anti-advertising. Advertising is harmful to kids, advertising is harmful for people, advertising frankly keeps the newspapers running, but little of them are still running. So in the privacy space, advertising is one where there is a community around privacy who sees advertising as a net negative on society, and therefore refuse to acknowledge the positives that come from it and see everything as an increased privacy risk. That said, there absolutely are privacy risks that our industry should take, and that's where the skeptic comes in line, where you should ask us questions about how do we do data handling, how are we protecting the data. But if it starts from the premise that advertising is net bad, then that Luddite is coming there to break the machines. If you think the story of Luddite is Ned Ludd was a guy who saw the end of weaving in his village and broke the machines, literally broke them. So the Luddite coming to the table in a multi-stakeholder event doesn't want to reach compromise, doesn't want to see a solution to the problem. They want to break the machine. And so when I look at the Luddites who are in the reported story, if their goal is to not make it better but to break the machine, then that should be recognized. Their voice should be heard. I don't think that it's a wrong voice. But to your point, privacy is a perfect example of where you have people who say, you do anything like this, it's bad, don't. And rather than how do we do it safely, effectively, with an acknowledgement of the various risk cases. And so that, and then to the question of how does that develop? Well, oftentimes it's a business case. Outside of technology, you see it. There are examples where money is raised around a particular issue, or say this wildlife species. But if you dig down into it, you'll find that very little of that money actually goes to support that specific species, and instead it tends to stay inside the organization. The bigger, better known ones don't have that problem. My wife is a veterinarian, so she's seen some of this in her work, where her clients will come in and say, well, what about this article? And she digs in, it's like 10 cents on a dollar goes to actually helping the problem. So those are people who benefit from your question. But an economic incentive to scare the pants out of people because it makes them money, it drives their next email, or in some cases it drives a business case that they want to see successful.
Also, coming up, I isn't anywhere that I would work, so we'd be happy to question over.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gabriel. A lot of good points made, and the one that struck me though was I think by Ashley. I think you said that technology, when it doesn't work, that's when it's used. It's not used when it does, right? And this is very much related to the title of this whole event, right? Is tech reporting too pessimistic? And I wonder, I find it absurd, and I wonder who determines that. Why not use when technology works, when it's solving, I'm imagining a number of problems every day. It's getting better. And maybe something like medicine or biotech before you get to, I can check my email. Why would it be interesting for somebody to read, hey, here's what we found today, or here's how this tool was used today differently than before, and solved a new problem without even inventing anything.
I would say really quickly though, we have a reporter who is actually on that side. I read Gizmodo every single day because it writes about things that are interesting and changing and breaking the ground. So I expect a different outcome, but Gizmodo is like, these are the best 5 headsets you should buy now with Bluetooth today. And then I know that when Christmas rolls around, there'll be another article about the 5 best headsets I can buy with Bluetooth. And so in confidence, I'm confident that there are those who are writing about the cool, the next, the latest, and that's great too. So.
Yeah, there's a role for, both of those kinds of stories. So, I'm a policy writer, so I'm not going to write about, lawmaker uses his email and it works. That's not a story. Right, but when the tangles with regulators and industry happen, that's what happens out of the norm. That's what's interesting. That's what's different. When everything's running smoothly and doing what it sets out to do, that's great, but it's just not as newsworthy as when that doesn't happen. And that's kind of fundamentally how it happens everywhere with plane crashes or anything else. It's when things do what they set out to do, it's just inherently not as newsworthy as when they don't.
Although I have to say there is one example where that was not the case. That was when SpaceX managed to land that reusable rocket thing on the little platform in the middle of the ocean. They finally managed to do it. That was news because it had been crashing. And there's stories. So cool. Right. Yeah, that was one example.
Right, and some of this is journalism semantics, right? There's news, there's features, there's news features, there's soft news and hard news. Hard news is always going to be the one credit. Soft news is always going to be the story of the wonderful new device that makes it online, because they all get done. So I think some of it is just, we're kind of talking sort of in the hard news, and that doesn't mean all the other stories don't happen.
Yep. Hi, Rick Lane. This is the other side of the Great Wall, the 21st Century Fox and News Corp, and we owned the Wall Street Journal at the time.
We have a lot of talk.
That's actually very interesting. That's what my point that I was going to make is that you talk about trust between the reporters and the readers, but there's also trust between sort of corporations and reporters. You never want to be the pilot of the plane that crashes your corporate stock, right? So you're really cautious about talking to reporters. And what you do is you get that call and you call one of your trade associations and say, you guys need to talk to them because we just can't put our name on it, which is why you call into a trade association in the first place. But one of the reasons why I left 21st Century Fox recently was I wanted to focus on being able to talk more about some of the issues that I'm truly interested in. And Rob does this, I'm working on an issue I call the Uber rich versus Uber driver, the impact of autonomous vehicles on the demise of the American middle class. And I do see trends that are outside just automation and other areas, but there's a whole bunch of clouds that are forming that are concerned. But if I was at 21st Century Fox, I could not talk to a reporter and say, here's my thoughts on this from a personal level. You have to run the traps of a corporation, and most of the time it's just like, why do you want your name to be out there? So how do you deal with that sort of trusted side between the sources and the reporters as well?
I think you're giving a perfect illustration of why you see certain voices being the visible scientists or the leading experts, right? Is that some people work in organizations that want them to be out there and want them to be the public voice. And if you're a reporter working on a tight news cycle and you're waiting for someone to get clearance, eventually you're just not going to, unless you're looking at a very long-term story, you're not going to be able to do that anymore, right? And then you get into also the question of anonymous sources. Let's do this off the record. Let's do this from deep background. And then you have two different issues of trust, the trust between the reporter and the source, and the trust between the reporter and the reader, viewer, and listener. I'm going to trust you that you didn't make up this stuff, right, just to plug the hole. And so it becomes a very complicated terrain. But yes, when I've done chemistry, toxicology reporting, dealing with trying to get an answer from corporations is often incredibly difficult. And so I've been straight out of here. And I am really interested in what you're doing, actually. Anyone else?
I think there could be some
value. I think there's value in making it easier for reporters to find people on deadline. There used to be a service called ProfNet, which is still there, but people tend to use it because they're just getting inundated with a bunch of PR people. That was my experience years ago when I used it. And I think it was interesting a few years ago there was a problem with Silicon Valley where you couldn't find women on panels, and the organizers would say, well, they're the so we can't put them on panels, or we can't have any minorities on panels, because they're not there, you know? I can't remember to do that, but something I remember was a list of like 100 women that you could put, their CEOs, COOs, C-level types, who you could put on your panel, and it was great, because they're there, you just have to find them, and for reporters on deadline, it's so hard. You know, having resources for people, organizations who could create expert lists for people who we might be able to contact, where it's not just disabled people at a time. If you could kind of have people who create such things, I think that would be highly useful for reporters.
And more people who are willing to go on record.
So that's the big problem. There's a lot of times, even as a trade association, you can't give all of the parts of the story that you need, because sometimes our information is on hearsay also. Right? I heard from somebody, oh, well, Congressman so-and-so said this. I wouldn't want you to print it, but it does inform how we reached the conclusion that we reached, and the conclusion we've heard others reach. I think on your point about women in tech, one of the areas that makes it it's interesting and often it's subject matter specific. For example, if you were to do a panel on privacy, you could staff it with only women 3 rows deep before you ever get to men. Chief Privacy Officer of Apple is a woman. Chief, of Slack and Toads. Now Slack used to be at Google, and you go down the list. On privacy, almost all of your butt-kicking women, and now Erin Egan is head of Facebook, but she was head of privacy, are out of there. So it's not hard. It gets harder when you get to engineering, which is why that story was very interesting with Uber. On the engineering panel, it's hard. We do need to do a better job of creating lists. We were fortunate at our group to have a bunch of women who are actually engineers and coders that we try to push forward. But it's even in that context, it's interesting how niche it gets fast.
Great. We're at time. I'll stop there. Just one way of thinking of panelists, because we have diverse balanced views on all sides, and we have an appendix in the report if you're interested in the details. But please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you.
At this point, I feel like I'm touching on